Hey everyone! So in today's video I thought it would be fun to go over some of the pros and cons I've learned from gardening on a rooftop deck. So ever since I've been gardening as an adult, I've basically never gardened on the ground. Growing up, my mom had a little garden in the backyard, my grandparents had a huge garden in the backyard, but I didn't start gardening on my own until I moved to Chicago. And here, the only outdoor space I ever had started with very small balconies. Then we got more space about 4 years ago in 2019 on a rooftop deck at a place we were renting. Then we moved into our place now since 2020, and I've been gardening here on the rooftop deck as well. So basically the last 4 years I've had, I'd say, roughly the same amount of space. So our deck now is about 18 by 19, so pretty good size space for a garden, especially in the city. But there are definitely some things I very much enjoy about gardening on a rooftop, and some things I don't quite enjoy as much. And I figured I would start with what I consider to be cons, that way we can end on a good note. Plus, I think there's actually a lot fewer cons than there are pros. I actually really enjoy some of the benefits of gardening on a rooftop deck. So I have my list here, and let's go ahead and get started. And if you also garden either on a rooftop deck or a balcony, let me know if any of these apply to you, or if you have some additional pros and cons that I haven't mentioned. So the first con I would say is getting everything up to your rooftop deck. So if you live maybe in a building with an elevator, probably not as big of a deal. We don't have an elevator, so everything has to come upstairs. And that always seems fine, the first 3 trips that you take. But then as you realize you're gonna have to make 10, 20 trips up and down, carrying very heavy items, it becomes a bit less fun, but you get it up here anyway. I would say the heaviest things to carry, and the things I probably carry up the most, are definitely bags of soil. Those I can carry on my own though, but it's only 1 bag at a time, and typically I need to haul a few bags up here every year. Also things that are heavy, I did get mulch last year and luckily had some left over for this year, so I didn't have to get any more, but that I cannot carry on my own. So my husband had to do that. And that's another thing too, you are going to be restricted by what you can carry. I can't drive a forklift up here for things that are heavy. If I get, a large tree, it has to be something that we can potentially carry up ourselves. So yeah, soil and mulch are the heaviest things. For things like my elevated beds, I had to carry those up piece by piece and then put them together up here instead of being able to construct them and then bring them up as the elevated bed. Plants aren't that hard, that's just more trips, but again, plants typically aren't heavy unless you're getting something quite large. So that I would say is probably the largest con, is just figuring out how you're going to transport everything up here. So the next con for rooftop gardening, or any sort of balcony gardening not on the ground, is you do have to be concerned with your weight limits. So when it comes to something like a deck or balcony, you want to understand your deck capacity, and that's a term I did not know until we moved into our place in 2020, and I realized I didn't want to cause any structural damage to our home. So if you don't know what deck capacity is, it's basically the pound per square foot that your deck can hold. You want to make sure you know what that is. I actually have a whole video talking about deck capacity, how we determined what ours was, and I will link that below. But you obviously don't want to cause damage to your home just so you can garden. So make sure you understand your deck capacity and that you are finding things that will work on your space. So I would say, our deck capacity, it's 100 pounds per square foot, which is really good, so we can feel pretty safe putting most stuff up here. If I didn't have that large a capacity, I probably wouldn't do the elevated beds. I would stick to like plastic pots and grow bags, because it's not really the plants themselves that are heavy, it's usually the soil, the size of the containers, and the weight of the containers themselves. So that is something to keep in mind and can be a bit limiting for anyone gardening on a rooftop deck. Next, and this is something that I have been dealing with recently, just recently made a video, it's that the weather on your rooftop deck is going to be more extreme typically than it is on the ground. Up here on the deck, something that's both a pro and a con is we get full sun. There's some trees here that block it a little bit in the afternoon, but typically, depending on how tall your building is, you're not going to have a lot of things that are providing shade naturally, so you're going to get full sun, which is great for full sun plants, but it can also be too much sun. I mean, I even have plants up here that would normally do well in like part sun, part shade, They have to be 100% in the shade, like the hydrangeas. Even some of my plants that love full sun, it can get a bit too much for them up here, especially when the temperatures are really high. So the weather's gonna feel more extreme. I would say when I'm out here gardening, whatever the temperature is, like in general, it feels 10 degrees warmer up here than it does on the ground. So it also can make gardening a little bit difficult. I tend to, during the summer, avoid anything except like before 8 a.m. and maybe after 6 or 7 p.m. because that's when it's cool enough to garden out here comfortably for long periods of time. Other than the sun and the heat, wind is typically going to be more extreme up here. Again, there's just not as much to buffer the wind, so you do want to keep that in mind when you're gardening. I didn't keep it in mind as much last year, and then this year I've been more conscious about the height of plants, where I'm putting them, making sure that things are staked, just so I know that if there are any heavy windstorms, I can rest a little bit easier that not all of my plants are going to get blown away. I mean, I still nervously stare through the glass doors to make sure things are okay, but us too, with the brick wall around, having a solid wall definitely helps. So I'd say if you are gardening on a space that maybe has railings, finding something that you can cover off the spaces between the railings will definitely help cut down on the wind. Cold, not really as much of an issue because I'm not really gardening when it's that cold outside. We're typically shut in for the winter, but heat, wind, sun have all been issues for me up here. The rain, obviously, but I think that's pretty much going to be common whether you're up here or on the ground. So I would say those are my main cons to rooftop gardening. There's a lot of other things you want to be aware of, but that's more related to just container gardening in general, whether you're on a rooftop deck or not. So for example, your containers are going to dry out faster than if you're planting things in the ground, but that's going to happen whether you're doing it on a rooftop deck or a patio deck that is right next to your yard. But rooftop in general, those I would say are the main cons. So now let's move into the happier list of the pros of rooftop deck gardening. So I would say my number one pro is there are fewer pests that I have to worry about. Basically, if it can't fly, it can't really get up here. So things I don't deal with that I know a lot of other gardeners do is deer, rabbits, squirrels. Even though there's trees, I've never seen a squirrel climb this high up here. Any sort of other animal like that that might want to eat your plants doesn't get up here. I know I'm going to jinx this saying this, but I also haven't had many issues with birds, which is a little bit odd. So I do see pigeons, cardinals, a bunch of birds kind of around the area. I've seen some walking like on the wall of the deck, but as far as I've noticed, no birds have ever bothered my garden. And I don't know why that is, but like I said, I'm probably jinxing that now, but like I've never had to cover my blueberries. Those don't get eaten by the birds. They seem to pretty much stay away, although maybe they just haven't found it yet. Pests that I do deal with, so obviously I have caterpillars that I'll find, but I try to save those, unless of course they're the budworms, and then I will get rid of them. Beetles, I don't really have slugs. I don't think I've ever seen any slugs or snails up here, but anything that can be either flown up here by itself or transported by something that can fly, I do deal with. Aphids, insects in general, things like that. But yeah, some of the larger pests that I know other people have to deal with in their garden, I don't, and I really enjoy that. Next, as a benefit to gardening on a rooftop deck, is I don't really have any issue with weeds. I mean, I do have some. So sometimes it can get transported. If I get a plant from a nursery center, plant it, there might be some weeds that pop up that were just in the soil. We have maple tree, which I had a video eating the maple seeds, but that does blow some of the seeds into my garden, but not nearly as much as it blows onto the ground. And typically it's really easy for me just to pull the handful of weeds and remove them from the garden. So I don't do a lot of maintenance as far as weed pulling, and I very much enjoy that I don't have to deal with that, because growing up I remember spending hours outside just pulling weeds around my mom's garden, and I really don't have much of an issue with that. I think too, because things are in containers, when there is something that might be blowing a seed, for example the maple seeds, the plant itself covers the container so well that things aren't really falling into the soil. So not as many pests, not as many weeds gardening on a rooftop deck. I would say another benefit of rooftop gardening, which could also be a con for some people, but I have really learned to appreciate it, is limited space. And I know that might seem weird because you would say, well, don't you want as much space to garden as possible? And I feel like, yes, but also I know I would get overwhelmed. So I know that I function a lot better when I have a limited space and I can really focus and cultivate the plants that I love in the garden instead of feeling like I have to do everything, because that is definitely something, especially when I first started gardening, I was like, well, I have to plant every single plant because that's the fun of gardening. But that can also get very overwhelming. I've planted a lot of things that I didn't really enjoy and just planted to plant, and it just wasn't as much fun. Whereas now, over the years, I've really honed into what I love and what works really well in my garden, and I've just been able to focus on that. So now there isn't really a plant that I come out and say like, you know, I really wish I didn't plant this, but it is taking up space in my garden, so I'm gonna, you know, keep it alive. But everything out here really does bring me joy. And I think too, it also leads me to be more creative than I would if I had, you know, a giant plot where I could plant whatever it was that I wanted, especially when it comes to kind of how am I going to garden, which container types work best, trying to find some vertical space. I just have to be a lot more creative than I think I would trying to fit everything into the space that I have. So for me, having a smaller area where I can really stay focused has definitely been something that I've loved about having a garden. Now, of course, there's also the overall benefits that just gardening has in general. So, you know, getting me outside, making me happy, bringing me joy, having fresh food that I know how it was grown to eat, even though I do feel like I'm growing more flowers than food this year, but that's okay. There's just, you know, joy that comes to the garden, whatever space you're in. So anything's gonna have pros and cons, whether it's a small garden versus a large garden, urban versus rural, rooftop versus on the ground, and you just kind of find what works in the space that you have. I mean, even someone else with another rooftop deck is going to have different issues than I might have here. So it's always very intriguing for me to learn about someone's space and what works well for them, and kind of the differences but also the similarities and issues that we might have in the garden. So lastly, I just wanted to go over some tips of things that I've learned in the last 4 years rooftop gardening, kind of going along with some of the pros and cons. And like I mentioned, deck capacity, try to find that out if you can before you start gardening. Again, just so you don't do any damage to your home. However, I think we did learn, luckily we knew somebody who was aware of the deck capacity, but if we hadn't, it would have cost, I think, a good amount of money to have somebody like cut into our walls to figure it out. So if you don't know your balcony's capacity or your rooftop deck's capacity, stick to lightweight containers like grow bags, smaller plants, etc. Don't overload, just in case something happens to your home. I would hate for that to happen. Next, because of the extreme weather, definitely keep that in mind. If, like me, you're on a rooftop and you don't have a ton of shade, make sure you're getting either plants that really, really love the full sun. You can also move them around your deck to see which spots they like better than the others. I have some, because my deck faces west, that side of the deck gets a lot more sun than this side, so there's some plants that like it over there better, some plants that like it over there better. So you can move your plants around, they're not stuck in one spot when you plant them. So definitely kind of get used to, there's a wasp. Okay, so I relocated because there were about 5 wasps swarming around me over there. And I used to be terrified of bees, wasps, all of that. Now, I'll hang out with bees, no problem, but wasps, I will still run away from. So in a little bit of a different part of my garden now. But basically, like I was saying, kind of if you do have a lot of sun, move your plants around, see where they like it best on your deck. Like I mentioned, the plants that I got that typically would do great in part shade, part sun on the ground level, really need to be almost full shade up here to keep them happy and making sure that their leaves don't burn. So keep that in mind when you're looking for plants that you want to grow in your garden. Kind of along with that, you can create shade, but that'll also kind of depend on your setup. So with me, there really isn't anything, like no structures that I can like hang a tarp from. I could install that, but I also have to be very, very wary of the wind. So I know some other gardeners in Chicago that have things like tarps, but when it's windy, they have to take them down or they will blow away. The greenhouse I had up here blew away, ripped in half, and broke. So it's kind of that balance between what can I do that will work for the shade up here, but also won't get destroyed in the wind. So it might be an option, it might not, but there are some things that you can look into to provide a little bit more shade for your plants. So I think that is going to be everything for today. Like I said, I really have enjoyed gardening on a rooftop balcony. There's just so many things about it I love. It almost feels like a little secret garden in the city because no one really knows it's up here except for everyone on Instagram and YouTube and people I bring up here. But if you're just walking by on the street, you have no idea that there's a full garden up here. And I think about that a lot as I'm walking down the street, just wondering what people are growing in their homes that we have no idea about. So if you have any either pros or cons that you've noticed from rooftop gardening, or if you garden in a different setup, if you are on the ground, if you're maybe on a deck that's on the ground and not in the air, let me know pros and cons of that as well, and kind of the things that you like about gardening in the space that you have, and maybe some of the issues that you have in your garden. But I think that's going to be everything for today, so thank you so much for watching. I will see you in the next video.